Catholic News contributed to the wider society by holding a mirror, I think, of this is what our society looks like. These are the issues, these are the problems, this is who we are in all kinds of different aspects. Social justice issues, issues of, celebrations, issues of popular religiosity, issues of, the fact that we are multicultural, multi-religious society, and a respect for that. Our motto, together we aspire, together we achieve, the things of discipline, production, tolerance, those kinds of values that Catholics in society could see. We are part of this. We have to be the people who make this happen, because this is where God has planted us, in this place, in this time of history, that our faith, our religion, our Catholic faith is a historical based religion.
If we think about the Catholic News, which begins in 1892, I think one important historical fact or idea is that it begins on the compound of what we know to be the Holy Name Convent. The French Dominican sisters were residing there.
In the 1880s, there was a very wealthy lady, Mrs. Anna Campbell. She was a parishioner of our Rosary Church, and she was a benefactor of St. Dominic's orphanage. And there was a crying need at the orphanage, because there are 20 senior girls who were in their 16s, and they had to be discharged, and they had nowhere to put them. Now this good lady said, I will find a house. So there was a college, Bolivar College for Venezuelan boarders, where we are now. It was called St. Anne Street, but it is now St. Queen's Park East. And she bought this house. It was an auction sale. She bought it in 1888. In 1889, she donated it to the Dominican sisters and said, I would like you to take these girls and to use your convent for a work of education, Christian education of girls. So it was accepted. So on the 21st of March 1890, it was donated. Mrs. Campbell donated the convent legally to the Dominican sisters. Now, there was one big, very handsome but old house, and outhouses, for the boarders. Now, in those days, Archbishop Patrick Vincent Flood was determined to start a newspaper, but he had to find a place for a printery. So he asked the sisters if they could have one of these outhouses. It was agreed. So this house was situated next to the main house that became the convent.
And from 1892 to about 1910, the Dominican sisters ran this Catholic News printery alongside the girls from the orphanage who were about to be discharged, so they became employed there. Then the Catholic News office printery moves to Belmont Circular Road, just at the bottom of the hill of the orphanage. And they continue that for decades. When I say printery, it is not just the weekly run of this newspaper. They're also printing flyers, business cards. They're also printing catechism books in French, Spanish, English. Later on, they print in Chinese, Mandarin, as well as in Hindi. So essentially, it was a French Dominican nun, religious sister, Sister Rose Vibert, and these girls from the orphanage. For about 18 years it ran this Catholic newspaper. Of course, it was founded by Vincent Flood, the Archbishop, an Irish Dominican.
First of all, the Catholic News is intended to supply a want, long felt, to provide the Catholics of the Archdiocese of Port of Spain with a newspaper of their own. Our avowed purpose is to give Catholic information in the first place, and on all occasions to explain, and if needs be, to defend the doctrine and practice of the Catholic Church. We purpose not to promote strife, but to give information, to diffuse the light of truth. However, it must be remembered that our columns will not be reserved exclusively for religious information. In them will be found the latest news about all events of public interest which take place at home and abroad.
I think the Catholic News has a very important role to play in nation building, because we have never had a program of nation building in the country. And it also has to give the Catholic perspective on the major things that are happening in the country at any given time. I don't see that enough. I think that should be constant, whoever is the editor. That people learn the Catholic perspective on the major issues affecting the country.
The motto of the Catholic News, which has always formed part of the masthead, originally in Latin, then later translated to English.
In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity.
The citation for it is St. Augustine, and that has remained throughout.
Theology is faith-seeking understanding, but the communication of that faith, and having people not be afraid to ask questions and to receive answers.
And that is what good journalism ought to be about. The constant encountering, the questions being raised fearlessly, and not necessarily being always answered.
Archbishop Harris, in his comments about the Catholic News, is that he wished to see more of that.
When you read the Catholic News, what or who is the God of the Catholic News? What image of God does the Catholic News present to you? The question is, has the Catholic News been a medium or merely a tool?
In the Catholic News, you could believe, hey, this is the truth. This is what was said. This is what we have the space to report this, because it's our paper. And we want, as far as possible, for the truth to be told.
conditions of the poor Indians and Negroes in sugar and oil, respectively, was nothing short of subhuman. It was clearly a case for early rectification. But how to do it?
My first surprise, there was relatively little comment about the riots and the protests. Before I analyze the comments that there were, the strongest impression I got from reading those 3 months of Catholic news was the paper's absolute obsession with communism, atheism, and anti-clericalism all over the world, but especially in Europe. Innumerable articles, I should really have counted them, innumerable articles, short news reports, longer articles, often taken from the British or American Catholic press. Innumerable articles attacked the wicked deeds of the communists in the godless Soviet Union, in France, and above all, in Spain. It was no surprise that when the Catholic news did comment on the events in Trinidad in June 1937, and this was in its editorial of 26 June, it was wholly negative. The editorial was titled, "The Folly of Violence." The editorial began, quote, "We have been having a taste of what communism means." The editorial emphasized the brutal murder of Corporal Charlie King and the shooting of Sub-Inspector Bradburn. They were the only 2 fatalities suffered by the forces of law and order. About the several persons who were killed by the forces of law and order, the editorial said, quote, "The floodgates of lawlessness have been let loose, and the lawbreakers have been paying with their dead and their wounded the price of their insensate fury and disregard of law and order." To his credit, the editor did consider whether we may have contributed to the grievances behind the riots. He asked, "Have we been just to our workers?" He conceded that low wages were a reality and that workers might become, quote, "the plaything of half-crazed agitators," communists, he means. He admitted that whatever just claims the rioters had ought to be considered, but only when law and order had been restored. We can say that the Catholic news was on the wrong side of history when it came to the 1937 strikes and riots. But granted the era, granted the overall church preoccupation with communism and secularism all over the world, granted the events going on in Europe, granted too the nature of the colonial Catholic Church and which groups had most influence over it, we can't really be very surprised at the position that the Catholic news took in 1937. And I reminded myself that even Captain Cipriani, the foremost labor leader of the 1930s and a devout Roman Catholic, even Cipriani condemned the rioters and denounced the communist leaders behind it. Now, in fact, the only leader who might conceivably have been fairly described as communist was Adrian Cola Rienzi, who had not yet appeared in the forefront of events. Butler himself And the vast majority of the people who went on strike, the people who rioted, the vast majority were emphatically not communists, not even socialists.
While I was editor at Catholic News, the anniversary of the whole 1970-71 uprisings that the entering into the cathedral and the whole thing of the whole Black Power movement. What is significant for me in that is that while I was editor of the Catholic News, there was the 40th anniversary of that. And a number of very interesting people came into the Catholic News offices to look at our records, look at the newspapers, look at what was covered, to read and to understand history, to ask questions. And that was really very instructive for me personally, because at the time I was still in school when that happened. I actually lived next to where there was, and Jack was all of these were people to be feared. But to come to understand the characters and personalities and what they were fighting for and the history that I learned through them and the documentaries that I was invited to afterwards to see really gave me a sense of how important recording what's happening, especially with a particular lens, Because at the time in the cathedral, the person who was in charge of the cathedral was a Dominican priest, a white Dominican priest. And his ability to relax then, to relate, to understand, was really very powerful.
Remember Basil Davison, Guy Haywood, Brother Valentine, Beverly Jones, Brian Jefferson, the others whose lives went down on the line. I wonder if these people gave their lives for a hopeless cause, and for their deaths, all those responsible people, the verdict is yours.
On February 26, 1970, in the course of a big Black Power demonstration in Port of Spain, several protesters entered the cathedral and draped red and black flags over some statues. They did not desecrate the statues. They didn't pour paint on them or anything like that, but they draped flags over the statues, and they engaged in noisy protests inside the cathedral.
I said in my article that came out in the first edition of the Catholic News after that event was that what these fellows were doing was protesting against some of the forms in which they see white domination of the black man being perpetuated in the society.
And this event, of course, brought the church into the mix, whether it had wanted to be there or not.
I was a priest of the Archdiocese of Port of Spain. I had done my studies in Ireland, and after I was ordained in 1963, I was sent to Rome. The 3 years I spent in Rome, where the Second Vatican Council was going on and eventually concluded while I was there. That was a wonderful time to be in Rome. A wonderful, because we were following, those of us that I was with, priests I lived with in a college in Rome, we were able to follow what was going on at the council. It was very exciting, the new ideas all over the place. And some of the experts that were advising the bishops came and gave lectures outside of the council itself. And we used to attend those, I remember that still. That was it. So, the ideas coming out of the council particularly were were influencing me, no doubt about that. And I came back to Trinidad in 1966 and was assigned to the seminary to teach philosophy and assigned as chaplain to the university.
Reed consistently wrote that the Black Power movement spoke out against real injustices and that the church must support its aims and ideals, even if not always its methods. Is the Catholic Church in our society in any way a structure of white domination? He asked provocatively in his March the 7th column, and he replied, I think that in some ways it is. The protest in the cathedral, Reed wrote, should force the church's members to think and to change. The church must play its part in the work of setting men free.
And so the black man, I said, finds himself constrained to conceive of the divine, of all that is good, true, and beautiful in European and hence in white terms. The church, therefore, contributes to perpetuating the state of psychological domination of the black man in which he feels himself inferior.
Reed said that society must be organized so that the many and not the few can enjoy freedom and dignity. That was his March 14th column. In his March the 21st column, Reed went a step further. He proposed that if society is to change, many will have to, quote, relinquish private control over much of what they now possess in our society, perhaps a necessary condition for bringing about a more just economic order and along the lines of what Christ told us to do. Pretty radical stuff in a church newspaper. I believe that the Catholic News reported and commented on the Black Power movement and the crisis of early 1970 in a responsible, fair-minded, and at times surprisingly open and radical way. The contrast with 1937 is very striking. The church in 1970 was trying hard to shed some of the less useful legacies of colonialism and reaction.
The writers in the Catholic News, not only me, others as well, tried to reflect some of the radical reforms initiated by Vatican II and the radical social teaching that had been developed by the popes since the end of the 19th century. So there was more to it than just shedding the colonial legacy. It was more positive teaching of radical reforms that needed to be made that were in the pages of the Catholic News, not only in my writings, but also in the others, and particularly the Archbishop, for example.
Sing this song for bread, peace, and justice. Sing this song for bread, peace, and justice. Sing this song for justice, peace, and bread. Sing this song for bread, peace, and justice.
So we have a masthead from 1975 to 1994. And the editors at that time would have been Father Peter Nicholson, Father Michel de Vertaille, June Johnson would have been sub-editor as well. But the 70s to the 90s, it's a different Trinidad now that the Catholic News is presenting. It is no longer a colony. We have gained independence, and we are a republic. In that period of that masthead that lasts, I believe, 19 years, you see a paper still trying to reconcile colonialism, trying to still chart independence or nationalism and what that meant. And it's also society recovering from the Black Power moment, the Black Power revolution, and all that that represented, all what that upended or troubled. Oil booms, it is a paper speaking to that. It's a paper speaking to recessions. It is a paper speaking to the coming of Anthony Panton. It is a paper that maintains his column on the back page, Ask Me Another, Nick's Corner. You know, it's a paper that's speaking about Maurice Bishop, Walter Rodney, the formation of an IRO.
Archbishop Panton loved and understood the cultural diversity of Trinidad and Tobago and always sought to respect, uplift, and integrate all. In the midst of the turmoil of 1970 and the Black Power Revolution, he came together with members of other faiths and played an important role in the formation of the IRO, the Interreligious Organization.
He was quite a moving figure in the early days of the IRO and indeed throughout. And he was respected in the country. And when the other religious groups knew that he was playing a leadership role and that he had believed in this and he wanted this, that they trusted the IRO and they trusted that movement to come together. So he played that role and he gave to the IRO credibility and he gave to it trust, and he made the other groups feel comfortable and welcome and in a way that they could have worked together.
It's a paper that's speaking about the coming of serve all. All that went on in Trinidad in the 70s and the 80s, and then 1990 with this coup. Not an attempted coup, this coup.
It was as if the country had gone mad. Citizens were breaking into stores and stealing what they wanted. Stories have been recounted of workers in these stores locked in bathrooms and beaten. Microwave ovens were stolen not because of the convenience they provided, but because they were mistaken for television sets. There was no uprising by the people, as Imam Yassin Abu Bakr was contending. Rather, they just stole.
Archbishop Panton's love of people and the nation transcended religious, ethnic, and cultural boundaries. Caught in the throes of fear and uncertainty during the 1990 coup, as he sang the national anthem on the radio station and urged the people to pray.
July 27, 1990 produced tangible insanity in Trinidad and Tobago.
Whenever there is disaster, whenever there is death, what we see is an opportunity for a new resurrection. But those must not be the mere glib words coming from the altar. We as church must try to organize ourselves in such a way that our people are able to take from what they've been given Sunday after Sunday and face the disaster from a different perspective.
When Father Michel de Vertaille and myself came into the Catholic News in 1991, one of the things is that we wanted to keep that the motto of the paper, which was there from the start. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. To be led by that. And also to be led by truth.
We have to prepare ourselves for doing the more difficult thing of making sure that we speak truth, even when that truth challenges the church itself. I want to suggest that the Catholic News became that under Michel de Vertel, a community of people who saw themselves as achieving purpose and who shared life in many more ways than just the typewriter or the pen. A community, therefore, in relationship, but not afraid of encounters or of questions.
I see the Catholic News as an instrument to really revive community in parishes, to challenge parishes and to challenge the priests to build communities. And the Catholic News being the instrument that reaches every nook and cranny of the Catholic Church in Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the Caribbean to do that.
I became the editor for Catholic News in 2003, April 2003 to be more precise. And I demitted office in May 2013. So there was a 10-year span of my being the editor of Catholic News. Female editors of the Catholic News have been few and far between. There have been two. I being the first, and Kathleen Maraj following after me. I always give credit that Sister Marie Therese, in fact, was the first real editor in terms of the person on the spot, getting news, going out there. This is a person who is of, she was French, she's French by birth. English was not her native language, but she went out and brought stories.
Father Nicholson said, "You have to help me. The situation of the Catholic News is very serious. Financially, we can't make it because sales have dropped down so much. We have to do something quick to revive the paper, otherwise we could close it down." So I said, maybe we could go to the parishes. Someone could go to the parishes to see why they are not buying the Catholic News. I said, but I don't know who's going to do it. Father Nicholson looked at me and he said, "You, sister, you're going to do it." "Ah, no, Father, I can't." I said, "I don't know Trinidad, Well, you'll get to know it." And so it was. The Archbishop Pantin appointed me to visit the 61 parishes of Trinidad and Tobago. And he wrote to all the priests asking them to receive me, cooperate with me. So I started on foot. So I took the two parishes the nearest to the Catholic News, at Rosary and at Belmont, St. Francis in Belmont. Then I said to Father, we need some pictures because what I'm writing has to be illustrated. So they took a young man, Neil Hogan, to become the photographer for the Catholic News.
What's interesting in this period is that a number of columns that were written during these years moved into single-authored publications, became books. So Olga Mavrogodato's columns became Voices in the Street, a seminal work on history, Trinidad history. Marie Therese's columns, Parish Beat, became a single-authored book publication with a second edition. So in the early 1800s, the late 1880s, a French Dominican priest living in Trinidad for about two years, Father Bertrand Courtenay, he wrote a memoir about Trinidad of 1892 or so. And he published a book in 1893, and it's advertised in the Catholic News. Of course, it's in French. You know, life in Tucker Valley, where he attends a bullfight in Tucker Valley, Chagaramas, or going to a fire pass ceremony, all over Trinidad, going to Maruga, etc. Marie-Thérèse finds this book in France and she translates it. So each week in the 80s, she would publish an extract. Eventually that became another book publication, The Life of Bertrand Courtenay. But it was helpful because you get an idea of life in Trinidad in the late 1800s. Marie-Thérèse also did columns on each department and each faculty at the University of the West Indies, which eventually became the book titled A Light Rising in the West, which is the English translation of the UE Latin motto. So a number of really interesting book publications came out of Catholic News columns. All right, and of course Herbert Dolsing's phenomenal column for 10 years on NIS, benefits, etc. That, as I'd mentioned on some interview, all these columns were compiled in binders and are reference notes for the staff at the NIB office. Okay, so yes, it's a very diverse period of journalism through an ever-changing Trinidad.
The Catholic News has been evolving over these years, but it's still a strained evolution. It's still struggling to live encounters and to ask relevant, pertinent questions.